I found my grandfather's treasure map in a hollowed-out Bible, and by the time I dug up the first 8 million in gold bars, I'd already read the part about the 3 men he murdered to get it. The leather journal was wedged so deep inside the gutted King James that I almost missed it entirely. I was 3 days into cleaning out Grandpa William's attic in rural Montana, covered in dust and probably mouse droppings, my back aching from hauling boxes down the narrow stairs, when the Bible fell off a shelf and landed with a thud that sounded too heavy for a book, even a thick one. The pages had been carved out in a precise rectangle, the kind of careful work that takes hours with an X-Acto knife and a steady hand. And inside that makeshift safe was a book bound in cracked brown leather, its pages yellowed and brittle, smelling of old tobacco and secrets that had festered for 70 years. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Not because I suspected what I'd find, how could I? But because touching something my grandfather had hidden felt like reaching across the grave to shake hands with a stranger wearing his face. The first page had a single line in his careful, slanted handwriting. The same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas checks. For whoever finds this, I'm sorry. I was weak, and I was greedy, and 3 good men died because of it. I sat down hard on a dusty trunk, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. The attic was sweltering, August in Montana, but I felt cold all over, the kind of cold that starts in your bones and works its way out. The next pages were maps, hand-drawn, meticulous, covering 5 western states with X's marked in red ink that had faded to rust brown over the decades. Beside each X were coordinates written in my grandfather's precise numbers, depth measurements that went down 6 to 8 feet, and cryptic notes like "under the lightning tree," and 200 yards northeast of the collapsed barn, and beyond the Three Sisters rock formation. But it was the header on the first map that made my mouth go dry, my tongue suddenly feeling thick and useless. Sacramento payload, cache number 1, Nevada desert, estimated $8 million. $8 million. I flipped through the journal with fingers that had gone numb. More maps, each one labeled with a different state, a different landmark, a different fortune. More coordinates that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't have this journal. More dollar amounts that made my teacher's salary of $46,000 a year look like pocket change you'd find between couch cushions. Cache number 2, $6 million buried in Utah. Cache number 3, $9 million in Wyoming. Cache number 4, $7 million in Idaho. Cache number 5, $11 million back in Montana, less than 50 miles from where I was sitting. Cache number 6, $9 million in a second Nevada location. By the time I reached the last page, the total was somewhere north of $50 million. $50 million. But it was the photographs, tucked between the pages, that turned my excitement into something that felt like ice water flooding my veins, drowning whatever greedy spark had ignited in my chest. Polaroids, faded and cracked with age, their colors shifted to that weird greenish tint old photos get, showing my grandfather, young, maybe 30 years old, impossibly young with thick dark hair and no wrinkles around his eyes, standing with men whose faces looked hard, even through the grain of old film. Men in suits from the 1950s, fedoras and thin ties, leaning against cars with running boards and crane that caught the light. Men who looked like they knew how to hurt people, and had done it more than once. On the back of one photo, in that same careful handwriting, Tony, Vincent, and me. Sacramento job, 1952. The last time we were all friends. Sacramento job, 1952. The words hit me like a physical blow. I knew about the Sacramento train robbery. Everyone in my family did, though we never talked about it directly, never named it out loud. It was Montana legend, the kind of story that got told at bars and around campfires. passed down through generations until it was half myth and half warning. In August of 1952, a Southern Pacific train carrying gold bars from the San Francisco Mint to Fort Knox was stopped 20 miles outside Sacramento by men who'd blown the tracks with military-grade explosives. 3 guards were killed in the firefight, not wounded, not injured, but killed dead. Their bodies found sprawled on the tracks, still clutching their guns. The gold, nearly $60 million in 1952 dollars, vanished into the California night like smoke. Never recovered, despite the FBI's largest manhunt of the decade. Despite roadblocks and interviews and a reward that climbed to $500,000. And sitting in my dead grandfather's attic, holding his confession in my hands, sweat trickling down my spine in the suffocating heat, I realized that the man who'd taught me to fish in the creek behind his house and shown me how to identify constellations on clear summer nights and slipped me $20 bills when Grandma wasn't looking, had been the one who planned it all. The mastermind, the architect of 3 murders and the greatest unsolved robbery in American history. The journal didn't just have maps, it had everything. Blueprints of the train cars, technical drawings that showed every door and window and weak point, schedules of the guards' shifts, their names, their routes, their bathroom breaks, details about the explosives used to blow the tracks, composition C2, stolen from a military depot in Nevada. A timeline that broke down the robbery minute by minute, from the initial approach at 11:47 p.m. to the final getaway at 12:23 a.m. And a minute-by-minute account of what went wrong, written in the same calm handwriting you'd use for a grocery list or a recipe for pot roast. "Vincent shot first," one entry read, and I could hear my grandfather's voice in my head as I read it, steady and measured. "Guard named Patterson pulled his gun when he saw us approach, and Vincent panicked. Shot him center mass, 2 rounds. After that, it all went to hell. The other guards, Martinez and Chen, they tried to protect the payload. Brave men, good men doing their job, following their training, probably thinking about their families waiting at home. Martinez took 3 bullets, Chen took 5. I think about their faces every night. The way Martinez looked surprised more than scared. The way Chen tried to say something before he died but couldn't get the words out. I dream about them constantly. I found myself crying, hot tears that carved tracks through the dust on my face, though I couldn't have said exactly why. Grief for my grandfather, maybe. Or for the version of him I'd thought I knew. The gentle old man who did crossword puzzles and grew tomatoes and never raised his voice. Or maybe for those 3 men, Patterson, Martinez, Chen, whose names I was reading for the first time 70 years too late, whose deaths had been reduced to entries in a journal, hidden in a Bible in an attic, that smelled like old cardboard and regret. There was a section near the end titled Distribution of Proceeds in underlined text. My grandfather had buried the gold in 6 caches across Nevada, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, each one carefully chosen for its remoteness and geological stability. He'd done research, consulted maps, visited each location multiple times to ensure the ground wouldn't shift or erode or flood. "The desert doesn't forget," he'd written in the margin. "The mountains don't move. The gold will wait as long as it needs to, longer than any of us will live." And it had waited. Through the Cold War and Korea and Vietnam and Watergate and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Gulf War and 9/11 and the Great Recession, and everything else that had happened in the 7 decades since 3 men died protecting it. The gold had waited while my grandfather lived his quiet life as a railroad worker, 40 years of punching a clock and coming home to dinner and pretending to be normal. It had waited while he raised my father, while he bounced me on his knee and told me stories about the old days that I now realized were carefully edited versions of the truth. The gold had waited while he grew old and sick, while cancer ate away at his lungs. Karma, maybe, for all those years of chain smoking, and took his secrets to the grave. Except he hadn't taken them to the grave. He'd left them for me to find, like a time bomb with a 70-year fuse. The last pages were the worst. The ones that made me physically nauseous, my stomach churning as I read. Newspaper clippings, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, documenting the aftermath of the robbery with the cold objectivity of journalism. Articles about the murdered guards' families, their lives dissected for public consumption. A photo of Patricia Patterson, widow, holding a baby, her husband's son, born 2 weeks after the robbery. A child who would grow up with photos of a father he'd never met. Another article about Chen's 3 daughters, the oldest only 7, standing at their father's funeral in matching black dresses, their faces blank with shock. The article mentioned that the oldest Earl had wanted to be a doctor, that she'd been accepted into a gifted program at her school. The Martinezes had been 6 months away from buying their first house, the article said. The widow had to move back in with her parents in a cramped apartment where 3 generations shared 2 bedrooms. My grandfather had kept these clippings, had looked at these faces, these ruined lives, had known, in specific and personal detail, exactly what he'd taken from them. The final page was a letter, written but never sent, addressed, "To whom it may concern," in formy script at the top. I told myself it was just a job. It began, and I could hear the desperation in the words even through decades and death. That the gold was insured by the federal government, that no one would really get hurt, that we were just taking from a system that had taken from us, from workers like me who broke our backs for pennies while the bosses got rich. I told myself a lot of things. But Patterson had a wife and a newborn son. He was 28 years old. Martinez was saving for his daughter's quinceañera, had the money set aside in a coffee can in his kitchen. Chen coached his girls' softball team on weekends, never missed a game. I know this because I looked them up after. Spent years collecting information about them, reading every article, tracking down every detail. I made myself look. It's the least I could do, since I took their fathers away and left those families to struggle alone. I want to say I'd give it all back if I could, but I can't lie anymore, not even to myself. I've lied enough. I spent some of the money, though not much. About $100,000 over the years. Always careful, always small amounts that wouldn't attract attention. Most of it is still buried, waiting, untouched, doing no one any good. I don't know what to do with it. Can't return it without destroying my family, without admitting what I am and watching my son and grandson look at me with horror instead of love. Can't spend it without seeing their faces, Patterson, Martinez, Chen, every time I open my wallet. So it waits and I wait, and we're all frozen in 1952, unable to move forward or go back. Maybe whoever finds this will be braver than I was. Maybe you'll know what to do with blood money that I never figured out. I sat in that attic until the sun went down, reading and rereading the journal until I had whole passages memorized, until the words were burned into my brain like scars. The light faded from harsh white to golden to gray to darkness, and I didn't move. Couldn't move. When I finally stood up, my legs had gone to sleep and my neck ached from hunching over, pins and needles shooting through my calves, but those were the least of my problems. I was a high school history teacher making $46,000 a year in rural Montana. I taught juniors about the Great Depression and the World Wars and Reconstruction. Watched their eyes glaze over when I tried to make the past feel real. I had $23,000 in student loans that I'd been paying off for 9 years, the balance barely shrinking despite regular payments. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles, a cracked windshield, and a transmission that made ominous grinding noises when I shifted from second to third. I shared a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate named Marcus, who worked at the feed store and played video games until 3 a.m. with the volume too loud. I'd been dating Sarah for 2 years, Sarah Brennan, who taught English at the same high school, who graded papers while I lesson planned, who understood that neither of us would ever get rich doing what we did, but that it mattered anyway. We'd talked about marriage in that careful, hypothetical way people do when they're in love but broke. Maybe next year, we'd say. When we've saved up a little more. When the timing's better. We'd looked at engagement rings once, just looking. And even the modest ones cost 3 months of my salary. The idea of a down payment on a house was a fantasy so distant it might as well have been science fiction. And now I was holding a map to $50 million. The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing that wouldn't destroy my life or my family's name or my own sense of who I was, would be to burn the journal and forget I'd ever found it. My grandfather was dead. The other robbers were probably dead. The crime was 70 years old, cold enough that no one was actively investigating anymore, cold enough that even the FBI's cold case unit probably had it filed away in some forgotten basement. I could follow those maps, dig up that gold, and change my entire life. Sarah's life. The lives of children we hadn't had yet, but talked about sometimes, late at night, when the future felt more possible than it did in daylight. I could pay off my loans, buy a house with a yard. Give Sarah the wedding she deserved instead of the courthouse ceremony we'd reluctantly accepted as our only option. I could stop worrying about money. Stop checking my bank balance before buying groceries. Stop feeling like I was one car repair away from financial disaster. All it would cost was 3 men's lives. Men who were already dead, true, but whose families had never gotten justice, never gotten closure, never gotten the compensation they deserved for losing husbands and fathers who died doing their jobs. I drove home with the journal in my backpack, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, like it might contaminate everything it touched. And for the first time in my life, I understood why people in movies make such terrible decisions. Because when you're holding the solution to every problem you've ever had, it's amazing how fast your principles start to feel negotiable, how quickly never becomes maybe just this once, becomes what if no one ever finds out. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Marcus playing some first-person shooter through the wall. The sound of gunfire and explosions, a weird soundtrack to my crisis of conscience. My mind ran through possibilities like a hamster on a wheel going nowhere. Take the money. Don't take the money. Take some of it. Turn it in anonymously. Leave it buried and pretend I never found it. The journal sat in my backpack on the floor next to my bed, and I swear I could feel it there like a physical presence, like something radioactive that was slowly poisoning the air in my room. By morning, I'd made a decision. Not the final decision, not yet, but a first step. I was going to follow the map to cache number 1, the one in the Nevada desert. I was going to see if the gold was actually there, if my grandfather's journal was truth or the elaborate fantasy of a dying man trying to rewrite his past into something more interesting, more meaningful than 40 years of honest railroad work. If it was fantasy, problem solved. The journal would be nothing more than a curiosity, a window into my grandfather's imagination, maybe evidence of dementia in his final years. If it was real, well, I'd deal with that when I saw 8 million in gold bars staring up at me from a hole in the desert. I told Sarah I needed a week off, claimed I was dealing with my grandfather's estate paperwork, taxes and titles and all the bureaucratic aftermath of death. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was dealing with his estate, just not the kind that involved lawyers and notaries. She knew I was lying. We'd been together long enough that she could read my tells, the way I couldn't quite meet her eyes when I wasn't telling the whole truth. But she also knew me well enough to trust that whatever I was hiding, I'd tell her when I was ready. "Just promise me you're not in trouble," she'd said, her hand on my cheek. her eyes searching mine for cracks in my facade. "Promise me you're not doing something stupid." "I promise," I'd answered, and it was technically true. I wasn't in trouble yet. The trouble was still buried in the Nevada desert, waiting for me to unearth it. The drive from Montana to Nevada took 14 hours, and I had a lot of time to think. About my grandfather, who'd been dead 3 months, but still had the power to upend my entire life from beyond the grave. About the 3 guards whose ghosts were riding in the passenger seat, invisible but present, their names: Patterson, Martinez, Chen, running through my head like a mantra or a prayer. About what kind of man finds a treasure map and actually follows it, and whether following it made me an adventurer, or just another thief with better excuses. The coordinates led to a stretch of desert 30 miles outside of Reno, the kind of place where you could dig a hole and be reasonably sure no one would stumble across it for 100 years. The landscape was all scrub brush and red rock, beautiful in that harsh, unforgiving way deserts have. Beautiful from a distance, deadly up close if you didn't respect it. My grandfather had chosen well, remote enough for secrecy, stable enough that the ground wouldn't shift and swallow the cache, accessible enough that someone with a map could find it again. I'd brought a metal detector I'd ordered online for $300 that I couldn't really afford, a shovel and a pickaxe from Home Depot, and a GPS unit that cost me $200 and promised accuracy within 3 feet. The journal said the cache was buried 6 feet down, sealed in military surplus steel drums to protect against moisture and time. Under the lightning tree, the note said, with coordinates that should have put me within a few feet of the exact spot. There was only one tree visible for miles. A gnarled, half-dead juniper that looked like it had been struck by lightning more than once. Its trunk split and blackened, its branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. Standing under it, holding my grandfather's journal open to the map, I felt a weird sense of connection across the decades. He'd stood here, had looked at this same tree, had touched this same rough bark, had buried something that would change someone's life, though he couldn't have known whose, couldn't have predicted that his grandson would be the one standing here 70 years later. I started digging at noon when the sun was directly overhead and the temperature was pushing 95 degrees. By 2 p.m., I dug down 3 feet and found nothing but more dirt and rocks. More rocks than seemed physically possible, like the earth was conspiring against me. My back was screaming, my hands were blistering despite the work gloves, and I was starting to think I'd made a terrible mistake. That the coordinates were wrong, or the cache had been found decades ago, or the whole thing was just a fantasy. At 3:30, the shovel hit metal with a clang that seemed to echo across the empty desert. A sound that cut through the silence like a bell. My heart stopped. Actually stopped. I stood there in my 6-foot hole, staring down at the spot where a blade had met something that wasn't dirt or rock, and for a moment I genuinely couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world reduced to that single point of contact, between steel and steel. It was real. All of it was real. The steel drum was buried exactly where my grandfather said it would be. 6 feet down, sealed with industrial welding, that had held for 70 years. It took me another hour of careful digging to expose enough of it to see what I'd found, my movements becoming more deliberate as excitement warred with dread. There were actually 2 drums, each about the size of an oil barrel, their surfaces corroded and pitted by decades underground. The metal had corroded in places, rust blooming in orange patches, but the seals had held. I couldn't open them there, didn't have the tools, didn't have the strength left in my arms after hours of digging, but I could see the stenciling on the side of the first drum, faded but still legible. U.S. Mint, San Francisco, 1952. I climbed out of that hole and sat on the ground next to it, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline and something that felt like grief. The sun was starting to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that were probably beautiful but I couldn't really see or appreciate. All I could see was that drum, and all I could think was $8 million. $8 million my grandfather stole. $8 million bought with 3 men's lives. $8 million I could have if I wanted it badly enough to become a thief too. To inherit not just the money but the guilt and the blood. I filled the hole back in, working by muscle memory, my brain shut off. Took me 2 more hours in the dark, working by the light of my phone's flashlight, the beam creating strange shadows that made the desert look alien and hostile. By the time I was done, the spot looked just like it had before I'd started. A patch of desert that would keep its secret for another 70 years, if that's what I chose. I drove to a motel in Reno, checked in under a flickering neon sign that buzzed and hummed, and stood in the shower until the water ran cold, watching dirt and sweat and 70 years of history circle the drain. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I saw my grandfather's eyes staring back at me. The same blue-gray, the same slightly hooded shape, the same crinkles at the corners. The same eyes that had watched 3 men die and then spent 70 years looking at their widows in newspaper clippings, carrying guilt that probably felt heavier than any gold. I could walk away. The gold would stay buried, the secret would stay hidden, and I could go back to my life of student loans and shared apartments and dreams we couldn't afford. It would be the easy choice, the safe choice. A choice that wouldn't make me complicit in crimes committed before I was born. But I'd seen the newspaper clippings. Patricia Patterson with her newborn son, her face showing that specific kind of grief that comes from losing someone right when you needed them most. The Chen girls at their father's funeral, too young to understand that their lives had just been permanently altered. The Martinez families, shattered dreams of homeownership, of stability, of a future they'd been working toward. I'd seen their faces, and now I couldn't unsee them, couldn't unknow their names. Couldn't pretend that the gold was just gold, abstract and neutral, instead of the physical manifestation of their loss. It took me 3 days to find Margaret Chen Rodriguez. She was the oldest of the 3 Chen daughters, the one who'd been 7 when her father died, the one mentioned in the article about the gifted student program. Now she was 77, living in an assisted living facility in Sacramento, the city where her father had been buried after his body was returned from the robbery site. The facility was nicer than I'd expected, clean and well lit, with plants in the windows and art on the walls, the kind of place that cost money. I wondered if she'd saved for it, or if her children were paying, or if she'd somehow managed to build a comfortable life despite everything. I told the front desk I was a historian researching the 1952 train robbery for a book. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did teach history, and I was definitely researching. I just left out the part about being the grandson of the man who'd planned it, the part about the journal in my backpack, the part about the $8 million I'd personally verified buried in Nevada. Margaret was in her room, sitting in a chair by the window, watching birds at a feeder hanging from a tree branch. She was small, fragile-looking, with white hair cut short, and hands that shook slightly with what I guessed was Parkinson's, or just the tremors of age. When I introduced myself as Jake Morrison, historian, she smiled politely, but didn't seem particularly interested in dredging up old memories. "The robbery," she said, her voice thin but steady, carrying the slight accent of someone who'd grown up speaking another language at home. "I haven't thought about that in years. Well, that's not true. I think about it every time I see a train, which is funny because I've lived in Sacramento my whole life and trains run through here constantly. But I try not to think about it, if that makes sense." "It does," I said, and I meant it. "Some things are too heavy to carry all the time." She told me about her father, and I listened with the kind of attention I usually reserved for primary source documents. About how he'd worked for the railroad for 15 years, had perfect attendance, had been so proud of his job protecting valuable cargo. He wore a uniform, she said, her eyes distant, seeing something I couldn't. Navy blue with brass buttons. He'd polish those buttons every Sunday night, get them so shiny you could see your face in them. He was so proud of that uniform, of what it represented. She told me about how her mother had never really recovered from his death, had worked 3 jobs to keep the family together. Cleaning houses during the day, waitressing at night, doing laundry for wealthy families on weekends. About how her mother had died at 52 of a heart attack that the doctors said was brought on by stress and exhaustion and a lifetime of survival mode. We got nothing, Margaret said, her voice hardening slightly, steel showing through the fragility. No compensation, no pension continuation, nothing. The railroad said it wasn't their fault, that they weren't liable for criminal acts committed by outside parties. The insurance company said the gold had been stolen, so there was nothing to compensate for, as if my father's life was somehow bundled in with the cargo instead of being separate, valuable on its own. My mother applied for widow's benefits, but they denied her because my father wasn't killed in a work-related accident according to their definition. He was killed by criminals, not in an industrial mishap, so it didn't count. As if that distinction mattered to us, to 3 little girls who didn't have a father anymore. She paused, looking out at the birds, finches I thought, though I'd never been good at identifying them. They flitted from branch to feeder and back, their lives simple and uncomplicated, in a way human lives never are. We lost our house, she continued, the one my parents had saved for, had been so proud of. My mother couldn't keep up the mortgage payments on her own. We moved into a tiny apartment, and my sisters and I all had to drop out of school to work as soon as we were old enough. I was going to go to college. Did you know that? I was smart. My teacher said I could be a doctor or a lawyer, that I had potential. Instead, I worked at a grocery store for 40 years, checking out other people's purchases, watching other people's children go to college while mine struggled the same way I had. She turned to look at me, her eyes suddenly sharp, cutting through the fragile old woman facade like a knife through paper. Why are you really here, Mr. Morrison? I'd practiced this moment, had rehearsed different versions of the conversation in my motel room, trying to find the words that would hurt the least, while still telling the truth. But sitting there, looking at this old woman, whose entire life had been derailed by my grandfather's greed, I found that all my practiced speeches had evaporated like water on hot pavement. My grandfather was William Morrison, I said, forcing the words out before I could stop myself. He was one of the men who robbed the train. He was the one who planned it, who recruited the others, who knew the schedules and the routes and exactly how to make it work. The mastermind. The newspapers would have called him if they'd ever caught him. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. Could hear the birds chirping outside. Could hear someone walking down the hallway past Margaret's door. Margaret's face didn't change. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable, for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 seconds. I watched her process the information, watched her decide how to respond. I wondered if anyone would ever come, she finally said, her voice steady. If any of them had families who found out. If anyone would ever have the courage to face us. Most people don't, you know. Most people would burn whatever they found and pretend it never existed. Because who wants to be connected to something like that? Who wants to carry that kind of legacy? He left a journal, I said. Maps to where the gold is buried. A full confession. Everything. He kept newspaper clippings about your father, about Mr. Patterson, about Mr. Martinez. I think it aided him, what he did. I think he carried it every day. Good, Margaret said. And there was steel in her voice that reminded me she'd survived things that would have broken softer people. I hope it did. I hope he died thinking about my father's face, about the look in my mother's eyes when they came to tell her she was a widow. I hope it followed him into whatever comes after. She asked me what I was going to do with the maps, and I told her I didn't know yet, which was still true in that moment, though the answer was beginning to crystallize in my mind like ice forming on a window. "If you keep the money," she said, leaning forward slightly, her hands gripping the arms of her chair, "you're no different than he was. You might not have pulled the trigger, might not have planned the robbery, might not have been born yet when it happened, but you'll be profiting from my father's death just the same. You'll be using money that cost him his life to pay for your life. Is that who you want to be?" I shook my head. No, it's not." "Then you already know what you need to do," she said. "The question is whether you have the courage to do it." I spent the next 2 weeks doing research. Real research, the kind I usually reserved for my most ambitious students' term papers. I tracked down the descendants of all 3 guards, not just Margaret, but Patterson's son, now 68, living in Oregon, working as a carpenter, and the surviving Martinez sisters. The youngest was 74, the oldest 81, both still in California. I found copies of the original police reports through a Freedom of Information Act request that took patience and persistence. I found the FBI case files, heavily redacted with thick black lines covering names and methods, but still useful for understanding the scope of the investigation. I found dozens of newspaper articles from the 1950s, reading them on microfilm at the library, scrolling through fuzzy images until my eyes ached, learning that the robbery had dominated the news cycle for months. I learned that the FBI had investigated the case for 20 years before finally closing it as unsolved, that they'd interviewed over 3,000 people, that the reward had climbed to $500,000, worth several million today, but no one had ever claimed it. I learned that the insurance company had paid out claims to the railroad, but fought tooth and nail to avoid compensating the families. I learned that all 3 families had struggled financially for years, their lives permanently altered by one night of violence in the California desert. And I learned that my grandfather hadn't acted alone. The journal named 2 other men, Vincent Corelli and Anthony Tony DeLuca. Both had been small-time criminals in the 1950s, the kind of guys who ran protection rackets and loan sharking operations out of bars in rough neighborhoods. Vincent had been killed in a bar fight in 1967, stabbed 14 times over a $50 debt, dying on a sticky floor while a jukebox played Elvis. But Tony DeLuca was still alive. He was 93 years old, living in a nursing home in Phoenix under his real name, apparently having decided that 70 years was long enough to hide, that no one was looking anymore, that he'd gotten away with it. I found him through public records searches, then confirmed it was the same Tony from the photos by comparing his current driver's license picture to the Polaroid from my grandfather's journal. Same crooked nose broken in some long-ago fight. Same slight overbite. Same deep-set eyes. Just 70 years older, wrinkled and shrunken, but unmistakably the same man. I didn't go to see him. Not yet. First, I needed to make some phone calls that would change everything. The FBI's cold case unit was interested but skeptical when I first reached out. "We get calls from treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists all the time," the agent who answered told me, sounding tired and faintly annoyed. "People claiming to have solved everything from Jimmy Hoffa to the Zodiac Killer, to who really killed JFK. Usually it's someone who's watched too many documentaries and thinks they've noticed something nobody else saw." But when I mentioned the Sacramento train robbery and started describing details that were never released to the public, like the specific timing of the explosives, set to detonate at 11:47 p.m., not the midnight reported in newspapers, or the nicknames the robbers used for each other, Ace, Sparks, and Professor, or the exact military designation of the explosives, C2, stolen from the Hawthorne Army Depot. Their skepticism turned into focused attention that I could hear even through the phone. "Where did you get this information?" the agent asked, and I could hear typing in the background, someone pulling up old files. "I found my grandfather's journal. He was one of the robbers, the one who planned it." There was a long pause. "I think you need to come in." I drove to the FBI field office in Salt Lake City, which was the closest one to Montana, and spent 6 hours in a windowless conference room being questioned by 2 agents who looked young enough to be my students, but who asked questions that made it clear they knew their stuff. Agent Torres was a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of the good cops in movies. Her partner, Agent Chen, no relation to Thomas Chen, we verified, was younger, maybe late 20s, with the intensity of someone still trying to prove themselves. I brought photocopies of the relevant pages from the journal. Not the maps, not yet, but enough to prove I had genuine information. The confession letter, the photos of the 3 men, the detailed account of the robbery, pages that documented not just what had happened, but what my grandfather had felt about it. "If what you're saying is true," Torres said, after reading through everything twice, making notes on a yellow legal pad, "this would be the biggest break in this case since 1952. We've had tips and leads and supposed witnesses over the years, but nothing this concrete, nothing this detailed. But I have to ask, what do you get out of this? Why come forward instead of following the maps yourself? Most people would have dug up the gold and disappeared. We'd never has known." "Because 3 men died," I said, the words coming easier than I expected. "And their families never got justice, never got compensation, never got closure. And because I'm not going to be the person who profits from that, I can't look at myself in the mirror if I do." They wanted to see the journal, wanted to follow up on the Tony DeLuca lead, wanted to coordinate with local law enforcement to potentially excavate the Nevada cache as evidence. I agreed to all of it, with one condition: whatever reward money or recovered assets came out of this, I wanted it directed to a foundation for the families of the victims. Torres raised an eyebrow. "You understand that you might be entitled to a significant finder's fee. The insurance company's reward from 1952 is still technically active, adjusted for inflation. We're talking about potentially millions of dollars. Most people wouldn't walk away from that." "I don't want it," I said. "It's blood money. All of it. Every dollar is connected to those 3 men dying. I just want to make sure it goes to the right people, to Patterson's son, to the Chen sisters, to the Martinez family, to the people it should have gone to 70 years ago." She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Your grandfather would probably be proud of you, you know. From what you've described, it sounds like he spent the last decades of his life wishing he could undo what he'd done, carrying guilt that probably killed him as surely as the cancer did." "Yeah, well," I said, feeling suddenly exhausted, "I'm not doing this to make him proud. I'm doing it so I can live with myself, so I can look at my reflection without seeing a thief staring back." The excavation of the Nevada cache took 3 days and involved more people than I'd ever imagined. The FBI brought in their evidence response unit, specialists who treated the dig site like an archaeological excavation, documenting everything, taking photos from every angle, measuring and recording and treating 70-year-old stolen gold like it was the Rosetta Stone. Representatives from the insurance company showed up in suits that looked absurd in the desert heat, clutching briefcases and looking both excited and nervous. And representatives from the families of the victims came too, because Torres thought they deserved to be there, deserved to see justice finally happening. Margaret Chen Rodriguez was there, sitting in a folding chair under a pop-up tent someone had set up to provide shade, watching as federal agents carefully unearthed the evidence of her father's death. She brought her daughter with her, A woman my age who'd introduced herself as Dr. Susan Rodriguez, physician, the career her mother had dreamed of. And the two of them held hands and watched in silence. I stood next to Margaret, not quite knowing what to say or do. Just being present because it felt important. When the agents brought up the first steel drum, using a portable winch because it weighed several hundred pounds, everyone crowded around to watch them craft the seal with power tools that screamed in the quiet desert. When they shined a flashlight inside, and everyone saw what was there, a collective breath was drawn and held. Gold bars, stacked neatly, each one stamped with the U.S. Mint seal and a serial number that could be traced back to 1952. Dozens of them, gleaming in the harsh desert light, looking like something from a pirate movie, except this was real. This was history. This was evidence of crimes that had destroyed lives. Margaret reached over and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so fragile-looking. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being braver than he was." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I'm so sorry for what he did, for what they all did, for the pain they caused." "You're not responsible for his choices," she said, squeezing my hand. "But you are responsible for yours, and you chose right. That matters. That matters more than you know." The FBI had also brought Tony DeLuca in for questioning, flying him in from Phoenix with a medical escort because of his age and health. He'd initially denied everything, playing the confused old man, claiming he'd never heard of William Morrison or the Sacramento robbery. But when confronted with the journal pages and the recovered gold, when they showed him the photos of himself at 30 years old standing next to my grandfather, he'd broken down and confessed. At 93, he didn't have much to lose anymore, and I think part of him was relieved to finally tell the truth after 7 decades of lying. He confirmed everything in my grandfather's journal. He described the planning that had taken months, the dry runs they'd done, the way they'd practiced the timing until they could execute it in their sleep. He described the execution, his voice shaking as he talked about Vincent shooting first, about the chaos that followed, about the guards dying in the dirt. He named the fence they'd used to try to move some of the gold before they realized it was too hot to sell. That every bar was numbered and tracked, and impossible to convert to cash without raising red flags. He even provided the location of a 7th cache that my grandfather hadn't documented, or had died before writing down, another 5 million in gold bars buried in Utah near the town of Moab. Will was the smart one, Tony said in his statement, his voice recorded for posterity, for history, for the record that would finally close this case. He knew we couldn't spend it without getting caught, said we had to wait, let it cool off, let people forget. But then the FBI investigation got so big, so intense, so thorough, we realized we couldn't ever spend it. Not without ending up in prison, or dead. Will wanted to return it, wanted to turn ourselves in, confess and take our punishment, but Vincent threatened to kill him if he did. Said he hadn't murdered 3 men just to give it all back. After Vincent died, Will was too old, too scared, too aware of what he'd lose. His family, his reputation, his freedom. Guess he decided to leave it for his family to deal with, to let them make the choice he couldn't make himself. Tony was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of armed robbery and conspiracy. Given his age and health, he had congestive heart failure and advanced dementia, according to his medical records. He'd likely die before trial. But the families wanted the charges filed anyway. They wanted his name in the record as what he was, a murderer who'd gotten away with it for 70 years, but not forever. Not in the end. Over the next 6 months, the FBI excavated all 6 caches my grandfather had documented, plus the 7th one Tony revealed. Total recovery, $52 million in gold bars, their value substantially higher in today's market than in 1952. The insurance company, after 70 years and probably never expecting to recover a dime, got their payout back. And after legal fees and administrative costs, and the machinery of justice had taken its cut, the remainder was divided among the families of the 3 murdered guards. Patricia Patterson's son, James, now 68, a man who'd grown up without a father because of one night in 1952, used his share to establish a scholarship fund for children of railroad workers killed in the line of duty. My father would have liked that, he told me, when we met at the ceremony announcing the fund. He believed in taking care of people who did honest work. The Martinez sisters created a community center in Sacramento's Latino Quarter, naming it after their father, filling it with programs for at-risk youth and families struggling with poverty. He never got to buy that house, the oldest sister told me, tears running down her weathered face. But now hundreds of families will have a place to go, a place that's safe. That's better than one house. Margaret Chen Rodriguez donated most of her share to cancer research, in memory of her mother, who'd worked herself to death and died too young. She deserved better, Margaret said simply. They all did. And me? The FBI gave me a finder's fee, despite my protests, despite my insistence that I didn't want money connected to the robbery. Torres explained that it was legally required, that the insurance company had to pay, that refusing it would just complicate everything. It was $200,000, which sounded like a fortune until I paid taxes on it and realized it was more like $130,000. Still more money than I'd ever had at once, but not a life-changing wealth some people probably imagined. I used it to pay off my student loans completely. $23,000 that had been hanging over my head for nearly a decade, gone in a single payment that felt surreal. I bought a decent used car to replace my dying Civic, a 3-year-old Toyota with reasonable mileage and a warranty, and I put the rest in savings, emergency money for a future that felt more stable than it had in years. Sarah and I got married in a small ceremony in my grandfather's backyard in Montana, the house I'd inherited after his death. We planted a tree where I'd found the journal, a young oak that would outlive both of us, that would grow tall and strong and provide shade for generations we'd never meet. A living marker for the spot where my life had split into before and after, where I'd had to choose between wealth and integrity and had somehow chosen right. I kept my teaching job, still make $46,000 a year, still share my lesson plans with other teachers, still get frustrated when my students don't do the reading or don't understand why history matters. But I sleep better now than I have in years, and when I look in the mirror, I see my own face instead of my grandfather's ghost. My grandfather's name was in the papers, of course. The story was too big to keep quiet, too perfect a narrative for modern media to ignore. 70-year-old train robbery solved by victim's grandson was the headline in the New York Times. Grandson chooses justice over $50 million fortune, read another. Some people called me a hero. Others said I'd betrayed my family by turning in my own grandfather, that blood should matter more than abstract principles. There was a podcast about it that I refused to participate in, and apparently, a screenwriter in Hollywood optioned the rights to the story for a movie that will probably never get made. But I keep the journal, not the original, which is in an FBI evidence locker, but a photocopy that Torres made for me before I turned it over. I read it sometimes, especially the last letter, the one my grandfather wrote but never sent. I told myself it was just a job, it says. But Patterson had a wife and a newborn. Martinez was saving for his daughter's quinceañera. Chen coached his girls' softball team on weekends. He'd known what he'd done, had carried it with him for 70 years, a weight that probably grew heavier with each passing year. And in the end, he'd left the decision to me. Choose the money and become what he was, or choose justice and become what he wished he'd been. It wasn't really a choice at all. Last week, Margaret Chen Rodriguez passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 78 years old. Her obituary mentioned that she was the daughter of Thomas Chen, a railroad guard killed in the line of duty, and that she'd been instrumental in bringing his killers to justice 7 decades after his death. That she'd survived poverty and loss and everything that came after, and that she died knowing her father's death had been acknowledged, his memory honored. At her funeral, her daughter, Dr. Susan Rodriguez, the doctor Margaret had dreamed of being, came up to me and hugged me with the fierceness of someone who understood what I'd given up. "Thank you for giving my mother closure," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for choosing to do the right thing even when it cost you everything." "Your grandmother did the hard part," I said. "She survived. She raised her family despite everything. She never gave up. I just found a map." "Sometimes," she said, pulling back to look at me, "finding a map is the hardest part. Knowing it exists, knowing what it leads to, and choosing not to follow it. That takes more courage than most people ever have to show." I think about that sometimes, when I'm standing in front of my high school history classes, teaching about the gold rush and the railroad boom and the complicated moral landscape of American expansion. I think about how history isn't just dates and names and events preserved in textbooks. It's choices. It's the moment when someone stands at a crossroads and decides who they're going to be, what they're going to value, what kind of person they want to see when they look in the mirror. My grandfather stood at that crossroads in 1952 and chose wrong. Spent the rest of his life wishing he could go back, but knowing he couldn't, knowing that some choices are permanent. The best he could do was leave me the map and hope I'd be braver than he was. Hope I'd make the choice he'd been too weak, or too scared, or too selfish to make himself. I found his treasure in a hollowed-out Bible, and it led me to blood money and cold cases and impossible decisions. But it also led me here, to a life I can be proud of, to sleep I don't have to fight for, to a face in the mirror I can look at without flinching, to a future built on choices I made instead of mistakes I inherited. $50 million was buried in the desert, waiting for someone to find it, and I did find it. I just decided that some treasures are better left buried, and some maps lead somewhere better than gold. They lead to integrity, to justice, to the kind of person you can live with being. Every day I teach teenagers about the past, about the choices people made, and the consequences that rippled forward through time. And every day I'm grateful that when my grandfather's past caught up with me, when I stood at that same crossroads 70 years later, I chose a different path. The gold is gone now, returned to its rightful owners, or as close as we could get 70 years late. But the lessons remain, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, in a journal hidden in a Bible in an attic that smelled like dust and regret. Lessons about greed and guilt and the weight of secrets. Lessons about the price 3 men paid for other men's ambition. Lessons about choosing who you want to be when the cost of that choice is everything you thought you wanted. I found a treasure map and it led me home.